Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm here today to talk about the Morton collection and a piece of the collection that hasn't been talked about quite in detail yet. I'm a historian of Latin America. I work on the history of race and science. It's an honor to talk to you all, given the high bar that's been set by past conversations in this workshop. In the last three classes, this spot has been filled by Dr. Janet Monge of the Penn Museum. I'd like to thank her for passing the baton to me and for all of you for coming out to continue our discussion on an immensely important topic. As you all know, we've been talking about how science has both supported and challenged the idea that we human beings are somehow essentially divisible along racial lines, and how those believed divisions have then supported or challenged racism. Science once fortified the racist beliefs that people of different backgrounds are inherently superior or inferior, and among the many things we're addressing is what we can do today in and out of this museum to challenge that story. Among the things we're going to talk about is how geography, culture, and science helped make race something that could be studied in places like Philadelphia, something that we mark today on census forms, and how we are judged in school. Reckoning with those processes can help us face racism and figure out what to do with its slippery remains. The occasion for this conversation in particular is one set of remains here at the Penn Museum, a collection of skulls that used to belong to a 19th century Philadelphia physician and craniologist named Samuel George Morton. And I have seen a few people in the audience who I know were here before, so this is a bit of a recap, but it's just to make sure that we're all on the same page. In past classes, Dr. Monge and others have addressed Morton's background, his training as a physician, and how he came to collect over 867 human skulls in his lifetime. Morton compared these skulls to each other, measuring their size, shape, and cranial capacity, and published his findings in a series of books. Morton's followers continued to expand his collection after his death, so that when it was donated to the Penn Museum, it numbered about 1,500 human skulls, as well as the skulls of animals. To the extent that the Morton collection is known today to the wider public, it's because of the highly racist ends that its skulls and Morton's own, at times, racist interpretations were put to by 19th century white Americans. Like many Europeans and white Americans of his day, Morton thoroughly believed in a hierarchy of 5 main races: Caucasians or whites, Mongolians or Asians, Malayans or Southeast Asian and Pacific Islanders, Ethiopians or blacks, and Americans or Indians. Whites were at the top, blacks were at the bottom, and the others in between had a mixture of positive and negative traits. By the end of his life, Morton was convinced that biological race was fixed and permanent, and that racial characters, how people were, their culture, what they thought and believed and expressed, was also fixed. Race could be mapped onto measurements of the size and shape of people's skulls, and Morton believed that you could use those measurements to think about relative savagery or civilization. Sometimes he wasn't always clear about it in his publications, but you can see in his talks, especially later on in life, he's making these connections. Defenders of slavery in America, like John C. Calhoun and Josiah Nott, promoted one book in particular, Crania Egyptiaca, as I believe Dr. Monge discussed last week, as showing that whites had always ruled over blacks. Morton's theory in looking at the mummified heads and skulls that were brought to him from Egypt was that they showed evidence that the ancient Egyptians were in fact Caucasians, white, and that they had always ruled over Africans. So defenders of slavery like Calhoun and Nott promoted this book as a way of showing that whites had always ruled over blacks, justifying slavery on the eve of the Civil War. For his skull collecting and measuring, Morton was once called the founder of the American School of Ethnology, but because of the interpretations that were put to that work, he is now as easily labeled a founding father of scientific racism as the Pennsylvania Gazette had it a few years back. It shouldn't need to be said, but we nonetheless need to emphasize it, that these believed correlations between skull size, shape, and intelligence are wholly without merit. Skull size and shape, and more importantly, the size and shape of the brain within, have no relationship to intelligence, let alone civilization. As Janet has noted in classes past, Einstein's brain was smaller than the average human brain size, and yet he is still Einstein. As she's also explained, although the skeletal measurements of people from different regions and ancestries differ depending on nutrition and other environmental conditions, The overlay of our many ranges demonstrate the physical differences between supposed races are more negligible than differences in between them, as was just said. It's partly for this reason that anthropologists sometimes say we are all Africans at our core. But we're not all black, we're not all Indian, we're not all Asian. Emphasizing genetic similarity doesn't mean that experiences of race and racism don't exist. Lasting racism and structural oppression is proof that people of non-white backgrounds are discriminated against because of how they look, who their parents are believed to be, or, and here's where things get slippery, what we're talking about today, how they dress, the language they speak, where they were born. We need to understand how this came to be, how cultural, economic, and political ways of distinguishing race confuse the real facts of diverging recent ancestries and phenotypes with fixed biologies and characters. And how the study of race by scholars may have at times encouraged the collection of their dead, of other people's dead, and how structural and economic violence in turn encouraged the study of race. Next time, I believe Dr. Monge might be talking about the remains of enslaved Afro-Cubans that Morton collected. Also jarring are the skulls that reached Morton's hands during the Second Seminole War in the late 1830s. They were harvested by American soldiers from the bodies of fallen Seminole warriors who were resisting Anglo-American expansion into Florida. It's therefore impossible to understand the Morton collection and its relationship to the scientific underlining of race without thinking about the big questions of history in the Americas: colonialism, the slave trade, violence against Indians, laws that placed and kept people of color in subject positions in the United States. Now more than ever, today more than ever, we need to grapple with that long-term structural violence in history to help fight racism and figure out what to do with the things that propped it up. In the case of the Native American dead in the Morton collection, there's already been a reckoning. In 1990, Native Americans and allies in anthropology pushed Congress to pass the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which has compelled federal agencies and institutions that get federal funding to return Native American human remains and cultural items to living descendants. The Penn Museum has returned 118 of the Native American skulls in the Morton collection. 14 more are in process. And out of respect for Native American beliefs regarding the bodies of ancestors, the Penn Museum does not display or present human remains from Native American peoples. That is, Native North American peoples. In this public lecture series, you have not been looking at the skulls or photographed skulls of the Native North American dead. But, and if you were here at this first classroom, you'll remember that the museum still illustrated Morton's belief in 5 distinct races by laying out a set of American indigenous skulls. So how did they do that if they couldn't present Native North Americans? This is where my work comes in. It's important to emphasize that the museum's bioanthropologists, like Dr. Monge, have encouraged further investigation into the meanings and origins of Morton's collection so as to present those investigations to the public. I personally have directly benefited from that access. Like I said, I'm a historian of Latin America, and I've worked with the Morton collection in the capacity of studying a group that most of us would say is indigenous, but not is Indian, but still isn't covered by NAGPRA. This is a population, because they're not touched by the law, can be placed on display and has been placed on display in a series of public classrooms to represent Indians as a whole. They're in fact there on the table in front of us, and some of them are on the screen up here. This population isn't one that many of us would consider important to US history, but what I want to argue today with the little time that I have left is that their consideration changes our understanding, or at least affects a little bit, of what Morton thought he was doing, what he actually did, and how the difference between those realities helps us think about how scientific racism got harder over the course of the 19th century, while still opening the doors for other people to challenge it. It sometimes says that Morton's conclusions weren't much challenged in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. That's not exactly true. Some of you may know that in 1854, I believe it's talked about in a past class, Frederick Douglass delivered an important lecture challenging the scientific bases of slaveholders' claims that Africans should be enslaved. But some white and European scholars challenged Morton as well, and they did it by referring to this specific population. Their name is the ancient Peruvians, and they're the single most important population in Morton's collection, and also possibly the least understood. The first indigenous American skull to enter Morton's collection was from Peru, not North America. Morton proceeded to examine and collect more Peruvian skulls than any other single group, including Africans or Europeans. For Crania Americana, his important first book, he examined 100 skulls from Peru and measured 33, 23% of his total. The Peruvian dead haunted more than a fifth of the book's pages and 18 of the volume's 78 plates. In all cases, more than any other ethnic group. For his 1849 catalog of his collection, he measured 155 Peruvian skulls, nearly half of the total sample, and more than any other indigenous American population. And when he died in 1851, 206 of his at least 867 skulls that he'd collected in his lifetime were Peruvian, still the largest single population worldwide. I want to talk about why these ancient Peruvians were so important to Morton and why the meaning of their collection is different enough that we should be grappling with the way that they're presented, and that it's important to have them out, to have a conversation about them in this safe lecture space and classroom that we're having. Morton's many Peruvian skulls have been noticed before. In The Mismeasure of Man, the paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould suggested that what may have interested Morton in the Peruvian skulls was their comparatively small size, that Morton's conscious or subconscious collection, or conscious or subconscious bias, led him to collect so many small-brained Inca Peruvians. These are Gould's words, because it allowed him to plummet the average size of Indian skulls in general, and therefore further diminish Indians' reputation for civilization. Smaller skulls than the average, Gould believed, brought the numbers for the skull size of Native Americans down. But as bioanthropologists affiliated with Penn have shown, the plummet that Gould claimed to see was actually negligible. Morton actually weighted the many Peruvian skulls equally to Mexican skulls and those of so-called barbarous tribes. So there were three groups, and it didn't matter how many skulls were in each group, they were all weighted equally. So archival research into sort of an alternate explanation, so if it wasn't because he consciously wanted to plummet the size, what was it? Research into that question turns up something surprising. I want to suggest that Morton initially collected Peruvian skulls not because they represented a lesser group, but because he believed that they, as an ancient peoples, represented what he thought was a superior group, in spite of their small size. And this is interesting. It would be natural to suppose that a people with heads so small and badly formed, he wrote, would occupy the lowest place in the scale of human intelligence. Such, however, was not the case. So why did Morton think that? This is where we have to go back to the beginning of his collecting. Morton later wrote that his desire for collection began after 1830 when he tried to deliver a lecture on the 5 races but didn't have enough skulls. That included Indian skulls, and so he put out a general call. He needed skulls. The first indigenous skull to enter his collection was this one, an ancient Chamuyan, collected from an abandoned cemetery at the ruined city of Chanchan in Peru. It mattered that this Indian skull was both ancient and from a ruined city, as Morton realized when he went to go put it in context. He wanted to write a report about it. Before he set out to write a large, massive study about skulls in general, he wanted to focus on this skull and its relationship to artifacts that came with it. That report became Crania Americana, and what Morton learned and put in the book was this, that for nearly 300 years, Spanish and Peruvian conquistadors and scholars who were ruling over a society in Peru that had subjugated the original indigenous people had also been insisting on something very different for Andean Indians than what white Americans were insisting upon for native North Americans. Since 1532, Spanish and Peruvian scholars had insisted that the Incas that they conquered were essentially civil and sovereign, that what legitimized Spanish rule was the fact that they were already kings and queens, and that they didn't quite conquer them as so much as step in above them. So the Spanish wanted to show that Incas were as advanced, some Spaniards, were at times advanced as people in the old world. And these representations traveled in the forms of the images that you see here. So that there's this tradition of scholarship that Morton grabbed onto that asserted that Inca and ancient Peruvians were civilized, and second, that they were possibly the most ancient people in the Americas, and that by examining their dead, and here's an Inca being represented as being lowered into a grave, which wasn't actually how the Inca was interred, but it's how they thought about it at the time. By examining their dead, Europeans could judge whether their civility was real, whether the Incas, and therefore American Indians in general, were once highly civilized. In other words, the idea of letting the Peruvian dead stand in for the Amerindian dead is an old one. In the 18th century, Spaniards, Europeans, and Peruvians argued over what Peru's mortuary culture meant, what opening up its graves or burial monuments like the one you see at the top there meant for European estimations of Indians in general. There are all sorts of people in the 16th, 17th, 18th century insisting that all Indians were savage and barbarous. But the Spaniards, there's this line of thought that said, well, one of the reasons why the conquest was so glorious is that they were so glorious too. Morton read their arguments, read the original Peruvian texts, and scattered them throughout his work, particularly Crania Americana. He also realized that they were more collectible than other dead. Remember, he didn't have enough skulls to just even show 5 in 1830. That was partly because Native Americans in North America were fiercely defending their dead against collection. They were also picking them up and carrying them west as they were removed. So Morton realized that in the graves that had been left over by the Spanish conquest and before then, there was a dead that people weren't speaking for and that were easier to acquire. He thought that by acquiring them, he could establish both a baseline, because they're understood as the most ancient dead in the Americas, but also possibly a high watermark for Indian civility, as judged by the very racist standards of the day, of course. What mattered most to him was this, that showing that the ancient Peruvians and the Incas and the people who built the monuments in the North American interior, you know, the Serpent Mound in Ohio, for example, the mound builders, they're sometimes referred to. He wanted to show that they were in fact Indians. In the early 19th century, many white Americans claimed that they were not. They claimed that the Incas were originally Asian and that the mound builders of North America were Egyptians, Celts, or other Old World peoples, anything but Indians. You know, the achievements of Native North Americans couldn't possibly be because of them. It had to be diffused from somewhere else. What Morton realized was that by looking at the mummified Peruvian dead, whose embalming itself showed a medical accomplishment, he thought, embalming being fairly high-tech in the early modern world and still in the early 19th century. He thought besides showing achievement, it also preserved phenotype, skin color, hair color, and cheek structure. What that preserved phenotype showed, Morton believed, was that the people who embalmed their dead in Peru were of the same race as the Indians that Anglo-Americans observed in North America. His book's frontispiece depicted a living Indian, Ong Patonga, chief of the Omahas. The book's first plate, however, depicted an embalmed head from Peru. That plate was relevant for 2 reasons. Firstly, it showed that ancient Peruvians were embalming, which again showed civilized medical knowledge and Morton's standards. And secondly, it proved that the ancient Peruvian dead were Indians themselves. What followed were 14 more plates, and then Morton transitioned to the Native Americans in the present, of whom Morton was duly racist about their abilities, about barbaric Indians living in North America today. But his point was that America's pre-European civilizations were indigenous. In other words, this piece of this first effort by Morton to establish a typology of Native North Americans was in part an attempt to pull the historical reputations of Native North Americans up slightly, not down. There's a problem, though, like a contradiction in the argument. If you're collecting skulls in part because they're so small and, in his words, misshapen, and you're also insisting that they're highly civilized, and you are a white skull collector in the 19th century, what's the contradiction there? Yeah, if they're so small, how can they be so civilized if you believe that all people with small skulls are uncivilized? People at the time grabbed onto that. When Morton published his book, one of his collaborators wrote to him and said, "You've contradicted yourself. Throughout the book, you've hinted at a relationship between people's racial capabilities in skull size and shape, but the Peruvian case, if true, wholly disproves it." In other words, Morton's data, when combined with Peruvian history, disproved racial science's most core prejudice, and Morton had to figure a way to fix that, and fast. And what he came up with is this, and there are some examples of this here, that Peruvian skulls would have been larger and more rationally shaped, but artificial cranial shaping, a cultural practice that modifies the skull for aesthetic reasons, for group belonging reasons. Artificial cranial shaping had made skulls seem smaller and more badly shaped than they'd otherwise appear. There was only one Indian type, Morton insisted. And over time, he also backed off his claims for Peruvian sophistication. Over time, you see him insisting more firmly that there are 5 racial types, essential racial types, and they don't change. So he's getting more inflexible over time. I only have a few minutes left, so, and I apologize for reading. It's something that I really want to get exact, but Morton's arguments are challenged at the time. There's Frederick Douglass, who makes a protest against skull science as deployed as a justification for slavery. Before that, other scholars came down on Morton too. They picked up on this contradiction and used it to sort of debate skull science in general. This is an image of a journal from 1863 that shows 22 publications that all touched on the Peruvian skulls in the mid-19th century. This was something that people were grabbing onto Peruvian skulls and using it to argue about whether skull science had any validity at all. It also led to the collection of more and more dead. This is something that's true for both the Peruvian dead as well as Native American dead in general. People were arguing with Morton, but they were doing it by collecting more skulls to argue with Morton. More Peruvian skulls, but also the skulls of more indigenous people. And there's something to think about here, that even when people were sort of trying to contradict sort of that most racist tenet of skull science, they were still adding to the collection of the dead over the 19th century. I don't want to leave us totally there with that, and I'll close in a moment, I promise. But it's also, I think, important to talk about how the ancient Peruvian skulls, and there's an example of one of these too, also help us think about how non-whites and non-Americans have turned skull collecting and the arguments to be made from them to their own ends at times. This is an example of trepanation. Trepanation is a cranial practice used to relieve pressure on the brain from an injury. Sometimes it's also understood in a more cultural context. But it comes from people's collection of ancient Peruvian skulls in the 1860s. It was really contentious because what it showed and what people sort of tried to present it as showing was that Native Americans were doing cranial surgery before the Europeans arrived. This was, of course, a very controversial thing to insist upon, and so you had a lot of people saying, no, it's just shamanism, it's just magic. But our understanding of it as not shamanism, just magic, comes from an indigenous Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Teo, who started collecting skulls of his own, who went to Harvard and collected so many skulls, Trepan skulls, that in the early 1900s he established within the international anthropological community that cranial trepanation was medical and scientific. It still was occasionally debated, but it was enough that when the Hall of Physical Anthropology opened at the Smithsonian in the 1960s, they highlighted Peruvian contributions to cranial trepanation as one of the great findings of physical anthropology. With trepanation, Teo declared, Peru achieves first place in prehistoric surgery throughout the world. Okay. The point here is not to say that the sort of skull collecting started by Morton turned out okay in the end because it gave other scientists the tools to help disprove him, or because it led to the rediscovery of Peruvian trepanning. When we fight data with data, we can reaffirm the premises under which that data was originally collected. However, once we have these skulls, we need to talk about them. And this is what this classroom, and it's been very special for me, has been about. We need to talk about how collecting the dead helps solidify, but also at times blow apart racial categories, but how that deconstruction has been incomplete, and we're still bearing witness to racism today. We need to talk about how the dead, like the Peruvians, have many stories to tell beyond Morton that are both scientific but also historical. We need to talk about how race has been made in the past and how their believed attachment to certain geographies was used to exclude them and could be used to exclude them still. These are big, pressing questions. Thanks for your patience while I sketched out a little bit of it. And I believe there's a question and answer session that begins now. So I know I blew past many things, but I'm looking forward to responding. Thank you very much.
You mentioned Julio Cesar. What was his last name?
Julio Cesar Teo. Pardon?
To the microphone. Questions. There are two.
Oh, there are 2 microphones for questions. Pardon me. Sorry. Okay. And the skulls are, I believe, 25 of them? 20. 20 of the ancient Peruvian skulls are up here today, if you want to take a look at them. They're examples of, I believe, the first one Morton collected, as well as one that shows signs of trepanation, as well as ones that show artificial cranial shaping. Oh, there's a question in the back there.
Thank you for your presentation. Was this connected to the origin of eugenics, Dr. Carl Bingham and the Stanford psychologist that went on to talk about the inferiority of minorities to Caucasian? Did they interrelate at all with the skull genesis of size and intellect?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. It's a little bit out of my area because I focus mostly on Latin American history, and eugenics swings around to Latin America mostly in the 19-teens and 1920s. But I mean, it is a very, very mixed up soup of theory that through the late 19th century, pardon me while I hold the light out, that through the late 19th century meant that there were assumptions that could be passed from study to study, even if people weren't agreeing with Morton anymore. Morton was, in the early 20th century, was picked up and identified by physical anthropologists as being the start of their field, but his beliefs as no longer having any merit. And it's been interesting how the relationship of anthropology to Morton has changed over time because of his reputation. In the late 19th century, though, one of the people that we most associate with the foundation of anthropology, Paul Broca, certainly looked to Morton as one of his teachers. They never met, but as laying out the parameters of what became anthropology. And eugenics as a social practice. And does everyone know what eugenics is? No, okay. Eugenics is the control and an attempt to change populations by controlling how people procreate. It is by sterilization, in the belief that by eliminating certain traits from populations or certain populations from the gene pool, you can improve the general genetic stock. Something that you see a lot of in the early 20th century. It's something that we certainly see playing into the rise of Nazism. But in relationship to Morton, I don't see a direct connection, but thanks for asking.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk about modern social science theories that happen to come from books like The Bell Curve, in which it has an influence, like in terms of immigration policy today, in terms of trying to categorize certain racial groups, like according to IQ. And you have like different organizations like the American Enterprise Institute, which has tried to use these categories to try to keep certain groups out of the country. And I was wondering if you could speak on that.
I think you just did. Excellent. No, absolutely. Something that Stephen Jay Gould really hit on the bell curve in The Mismeasure of Man, the book that in which he argued that Morton's biases affected his anthropology, something that people debated and have continued to debate. And then he also then moves on to the bell curve. It is related. It is social understanding of race and achievement and how it plays into what people are imagined to be able to do is still with us, and I mean, the bell curve still comes up, right? It still gets deployed, and so this is one of the reasons why I think this conversation is so great that we're pulling it apart. Pardon? Yeah. Oh, and Grace will be talking about it later. So, great question. Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, at the time, was Morton's work accepted?
Yes and no. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. His first book, Crania Americana, the one I started talking about, sort of sank like a stone. He didn't get enough subscribers to it. He wasn't, he had to get help to publish it here and in the UK. And like I said, when it was published, people sort of picked up on this contradiction about the Peruvian skulls and said, nuh-uh, like, that doesn't make sense. You can't believe both those things at the same time. But it did have enough acceptance within a circle of phrenologists and other ethnologists that he felt encouragement to do his second work, Crania Egyptiaca, which was the one that proposed that Egyptians were Caucasian and had therefore justified white dominance of blacks. So it was promoted at the time by a few people in the US, and they are talking to large crowds. And so you can see sort of diffusion of his presentation of skulls into the sort of the wider popular culture. But it seems that some people were also looking at him and thinking that it was wrong and distasteful. It's the Smithsonian, for example, its first head made an effort to keep physical anthropology out of the museum because he thought it was too bound up in the argument over slavery. People at the time knew the fire that was being played with by correlating skull size or attempting to intelligence or civilization. But there were plenty of people in parts of the country for whom that made sense, right? Thank you.
Hello? Can you see me?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, this is going to be extremely ineloquent because I don't know what I'm talking about, so apologies in advance.
So was I.
Okay, so my assumption is if we compared like a skull from like northern Canada or something of an indigenous person versus somebody in the tip of South America, that we'd see very little similarities. And the same thing like from Egypt to South Africa or something like that. Was that ever used to dispute this idea that indigenous races exist or, you know, black races or whatever they were? And then a second question, my assumption is also that like Incas perhaps had similar heads, and maybe like the people who lived in what's today Mexico City, maybe they had similar heads. So is there a word for that genetic similarity?
That's a great question. So Morton starts from the presumption that there are 5 races. And the way he deals with that very obvious like variation is by suggesting within those races there are families. And so for the Americans, he says there are the barbarous tribes from North America. These are his words, right? The Iroquois, the Algonquin, et cetera, who have larger heads, larger skulls. And then there are the ancient Peruvians and the ancient Toltecas. And this is where it gets into the weeds of his theory. It's really marshy. He's very confused at times. But he believed that the ancient Peruvians existed before anybody else, or they're at least the oldest population that we can look at, and that the ancient Toltecas were both the Incas and the Mayas. And he thought that the comparison of the skulls of the Incas, the Mayas, and skulls from mounds in North America showed that they were all the same people. That was one of the ways he said this shows that the mound builders were Americans, were Indians. Of course, they are actually widely different. He's looking at like 1 or 2 skulls of each one, which is why people start collecting more and more skulls to compare and sort of take apart the argument, decide. And the way that 19th century anthropology deals with it is by saying, oh, there are many races. There's the Aymara race or the Quechua race. There is native North America is less my forte. But race is such a flexible term that even when he starts at 5 and then says, okay, no, wait a second, there are actually 22, people are able to work with that because it's so assumed. It's a great question. Thank you.